amigas, colegas, estudiantes. Les damos la bienvenida a una nueva sesión de Residencias en Historia, una serie de charlas organizadas por el Instituto de Historia UC. Para esta sesión agradecemos la colaboración de la editorial Mimesis. Hoy, 29 de octubre, le damos la bienvenida al profesor Dipesh Chakrabarty. El profesor Chakrabarty es profesor de Historia, Lenguajes y Civilización del Sudeste Asiático en la Universidad de Chicago y miembro del Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. Estudioso de las convergencias de la historia y el pensamiento poscolonial, así como de las transformaciones de la política de masas en el subcontinente indio, es autor, entre otros títulos, de Al margen de Europa, El humanismo en la era de la globalización, la descolonización y las políticas culturales. Desde hace poco más de una década, se ha venido interesando también por el problema del cambio climático, la amenaza del calentamiento global y su relación con el desarrollo del capitalismo moderno. Sus reflexiones han sido publicadas en prestigiosas revistas, comenzando con El clima de la historia, 4 tesis, publicado en el 2009 en Critical Inquiry, y que ha sido desde entonces uno de los aportes más significativos para una mirada humanista del problema. Recientemente, la editorial Mimesis publicó Clima y Capital, la vida bajo el Antropoceno, que reúne varios de sus trabajos sobre el tema. En su último libro, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, desarrolla estas reflexiones, evaluando la manera en la que las percepciones derivadas de las geociencias pueden alterar nuestra autocomprensión de la modernidad occidental y de nuestro ethos moderno. Es un honor recibirlo hoy en una nueva sesión de Residencias en Historia. Su charla se titula El clima de la historia en una era planetaria. Al finalizar, la charla será comentada por Consuelo Viskupovich, de la Universidad Mayor, y Patricio Arregada, del Instituto de Historia UC. Agradecemos al profesor Chakrabarty, a la profesora Viskupovich y al profesor Arregada a esta nueva sesión, el participar en esta nueva sesión de Residencias. Antes de comenzar, un recordatorio y aviso. La charla de hoy contará con traducción simultánea del inglés al castellano. Para ello, deben elegir en la botonera, una suerte de globo terráqueo abajo a la derecha en Zoom, el idioma de la traducción. Para aquellos que están en YouTube, la transmisión es en el idioma original y luego se sube la traducción. Profesor Arti, bienvenido, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Professor Mont, for the introduction, and thank you, Gail, for the translation. And thank you to Patricio and all of you for the invitation to join you. I'm greatly honored and really sorry that I'm not there in person, and hope that one day I will be there in person and we'll have a longer chat. I'm also grateful to Raul for having taken of Edición Mimesis, for having taken interest in my work and published a small collection of essays. So maybe I'll speak for 25 minutes, maybe 25 minutes on some of the ideas that went into the book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. And we can take up questions from there. So I am a historian by training, and of course, a humanist historian. And basically history of empires and history of colonialism, colonial rule, decolonization. These are issues that interested me. And so I have to say that as historians, and as humanists, we came into the problem of climate change late. See, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up in 1988 or 89. 1988 is when a well-known American scientist, James Hansen, spoke to the US politicians about global warming. But even in 2000, when respected Harvard historian Charles Meyer wrote an article in the American Historical Review, which was called Consigning the 20th Century to History. he had nothing to say about climate change. So I can only assume that an erudite and learned man like him had not heard about planetary climate change. And that was 2000. So even when I wrote my first essay in 2009, it was one of the first interventions by a humanist into the debate. And by then, the scientists had written books on climate change from the 1990s. The economists were already discussing questions of how to handle this. So the economists basically brought their entire literature on risks and risk management to bear on this question of climate change. Some philosophers were, like Peter Singer, were in the early 2000s, were talking about climate justice issues. The fact that the industrialized countries had more responsibility for creating the problem, while so these were countries that he called countries that were retrospectively guilty. And then he looked at China and India with their huge population. He said these are countries that will be prospectively guilty, that they will become guilty one day. But he was doing philosophical analysis, but that was close to 2008-07. But really, so as a historian, as a humanist, I felt that I came into the problem late, and others followed me. I would have been one of the first, if not the first. And that was by accident. But as I worked on the problem, basically I realized that there are three different historical problems from a historian's point of view coming together. So I was trying to understand the problem as a historian. I was, first of all, not trying to solve it, because first of all, scientists had defined what the problem was, planetary climate change. And economists and policy people and politicians were, and some activists from the Rio conference of early 1990s were already talking about what needed to be done. For me, I was very interested because it raised problems for the kind of history that I did. The kind of history that the basic problem was that subaltern studies, or even my book Provincializing Europe, when we wrote those histories about rights, about anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, we more or less separated human history from natural history. We thought that natural history didn't seem as important as it looks today, but we separated, and there was environmental history, but environmental history was, at least in the Anglo countries, a separate stream. It was not the mainstream. So now looking back, I think what comes together as we think about the climate problem are three kinds of histories. You might call them even three kinds of world histories. One is a history of decolonization, democratization, economic development, all post-Second World War in different parts of the country. And one of the interesting things, of course, since I'm speaking to people in Latin America undergoes a certain kind of nationalism, independence. You might call it decolonization in the 19th century, whereas the decolonization I'm talking about is the decolonization of the mid-20th century, Asian and African countries. And history as a discipline got caught up in several waves of democratization, so that peasants' history, subaltern history, women's history, indigenous history, histories of rights, basically told us that we were living in a world where people were increasingly fighting for their rights. The Vietnam War was going on as I was growing up, and the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese War, very much affected our historical thinking, so much so that by 1976, just as the Vietnam War was ending, there was an English journal called Journal of Peasant Studies that was brought out. And we started working on subaltern studies from the 1980s onwards. So one could say that there was one story of the world which was about decolonization, about post-war reconstruction, leading up to the 1990s globalization and what you might call a new imperial kind of capitalism being fostered from the period of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in England and Reagan in the US, the deindustrialization of North America, and the Chinese modernization programs that starts from after the death of Mao from 1978. This was one history. And this history was happening also as the Cold War was happening. But the Cold War was producing another kind of history of the world from, again, after the end of the Second World War. But that history was being written by scientists. And that one might call a history of one. So the human history was moving from democratization, the end of empires, to neoliberal capitalism, what we call globalization. That was one level of history that we were writing. Scientists were not thinking that they were historians, but producing a discussion about history of the world, which eventually became the history of the planet. And that happens because at the end of the Second World War, through the Second World War, both the Soviet Union and the Americans begin to take an interest in the atmosphere. And for 3 or 4 reasons. 3 reasons. One was that during the war, they were already talking about whether weather could be weaponized. Could you create floods in your enemy's territory? Could you create a drought in your enemy's territory? So interest in the history of in the cloud formation, in atmospheric science was growing, both in Soviet Union and in the US. Then they wanted to measure the radioactive fallout of nuclear tests. And they were also interested in the space competition. And see, it's really so it's 1958 when actually an American ocean scientist said to the president of the United States, and the United States president used to get advice from scientists annually on the state of the world's atmosphere. And a scientist says to the president in 1958 that humans are carrying out a great experiment by putting out in the air very quickly the carbon dioxide that it had and other greenhouse gases that it had taken the planet hundreds of millions of years to sequester deep inside the earth as fossil fuel. So Roger Revels made this point that this is an experiment and we don't know what it means because we are putting out this stuff into the air at a very fast rate. And then in 1960s, the space race was ratcheting up. And Carl Sagan's unit in NASA was given the task of finding out if Americans could go and colonize Mars. I mean, I still remember growing up in India, in Calcutta, and looking at a Time magazine with an American artist's imagination of what Mars would look like if Americans went there. And in the drawing of the artist, Mars looked like Manhattan, huge skyscrapers on Mars. But they wanted to find out if Mars could be colonized. So they wanted to find out if Mars still had life or whether it could be made habitable. So, and Carl Sagan hired a British chemist called James Lovelock, who worked with Carl Sagan's unit from 1960 to 61. And of course, eventually he came up with the idea of the Gaia, as you know. But these scientists were studying different planets, both Mars and Venus, and asking what makes a planet habitable for life. So none of them were biologists then initially. Eventually, Carl Sagan's wife, Lynn Margulis, was joined the team and work on Gaia, and she was a biologist. But they were asking a biological question, but asking it as physicists and chemists, basically asking what is life and what makes a planet good for life. And there was also this question of why is Venus so hot? Why is Mars so cold? And why is our planet, Earth, exactly right? So out of this came the understanding that once life happens in a planet, different forms of life play a role in actually making the planet habitable. And James Lovelock is famous for having said to this group, don't worry about making Mars ready for humans, make it ready for bacteria. And then the bacteria will do the rest of the job. Because because what was happening, they were actually studying the geological history of Earth to find out what was the history of life on this planet and what lessons could be extrapolated from the study of this planet to other planets. Out of which eventually comes a science called planetary science. But sometimes I say, so they were looking at Earth in comparison to Mars and Venus. And realized that on Earth, the atmosphere, one reason why we all live is because the atmosphere has oxygen at the moment at 21%. If the atmosphere had more oxygen, then things would go up in flames. Forests might burn up. If the atmosphere had less oxygen, animals would choke to death. And because oxygen is a reactive gas, it mixes up with other things, they realized that the planet whose atmosphere has oxygen has to supply the air with fresh oxygen every day. And they were asking who does it. And they found out that on this planet, it's really forms of life that humans consider inferior forms of life, like bacteria, fungi, protists, and phytoplanktons, algae-like very small plants in the ocean, and trees, of course. That actually, the phytoplanktons, for instance, supply 50% of the fresh oxygen. So if we warmed up the seas so much that the phytoplanktons died off, then we would shut off the oxygen we need. And when these guys were asking, for how long have these small forms of life supplied the air with oxygen to create the modern atmosphere? The answer was stunning to me. When I read the answer was for 375 million years. So when you read it, you suddenly realized that asking this question, what is life, gives you a perspective from the planet, where you realize that the planet allows us to live, or life on the planet, by creating this modern atmosphere. But this modern atmosphere was not necessarily made for us in view. Even if humans had not been born, the planet would have had this atmosphere to support other animal forms of life. And so that's why Lovelock said, make Mars ready for bacteria, and they will do the job. So this idea that life does something to support life came as an intuition to Lovelock, and he called it Gaia. But eventually this kind of muted into a positive science called Earth System Science. That was, the NASA set up the first committee in 1983. So it's a recent science. And it's really Earth System Science that is the science behind climate change. So it's actually a science that tells you how geology and biology are connected on this planet to make not just human life, but to make the maintenance of multicellular life possible. And the third history that came out of this was that there is a relationship between the human and the non-human, because human life depends on what non-human life and non-human things do. And what the climate scientists eventually were beginning to say was that humanity, with their technology and numbers, have grown so much that they were actually affecting what is called the life support system of the planet. So I'll just quickly show you some slides. That some of you know these slides. These are called the Great Acceleration graphs. Just to very quickly give you this potted history of the world that I was talking about, and to give some sense of when the problem starts, when the problem becomes acute. So I'm going to share screen and share my, okay. So these are called the Great Acceleration graphs. Will Steffen is one of those system scientists. And so basically, if you look at this, it is really from 1950 that everything that humans build, the water use, everything goes up. International tourism exponentially from 1950 on, telecommunications. So even if you say, it's capitalism doing it, it's not, the acceleration happens really from the 1950 on. And this is a breakup. If you break it up, then I don't know if you can see it, then you find that in the 1950s, most of the contributions, the growth came from OECD countries, reconstructing their economies after the war. And then you get the BRIC countries and other countries. Now, if there were no climate problems, you could read these graphs as evidence of humans living better and living well. I should also tell you that in this period, the rate at which human middle class, consuming classes grew also picked up pace. So for instance, so if you look at population figure, so we were 1.6 billion in 1900, and we were 6 billion at 2000, and now we're about 8 billion. So it's really, but the population actually at the end of the Second World War, we were about 3 billion. So we add 3 billions in the last part of the century, and then 2 billions in 20 years. So more human, particularly after the introduction of antibiotics during the Second World, from the 1930s, and all the public health sort of moves from the late 19th century. So there were more humans living, more humans surviving. So the human population expanded, technology expanded, large dams, everything expands. So if there are no climate problems, you would actually see this as a story about humans living better than ever. But this actually, these graphs tell you about how the planet was reacting to what was happening in human history. And again, you see that everything goes up from 1950. So, looking at this, what the proposition the scientists were making was, and I'll make these two statements and end, stop for now, and then, so the scientists were saying two things that were of interest to me as a historian. One is, of course, they said that that this huge expansion of the human realm was, and therefore the emission of greenhouse gases was warming up the temperature of the planet. The temperature of the planet warming up meant that the seas were not only rising, the seas were also becoming more acidic, the oceans. And generally the more acidic the seas become, the more it has an impact on creatures, small sea creatures that make shells, for instance. They can't make those shells. Or as I said, if the temperature goes up very high, like 6 degrees, then the phytoplankton will die. And some of the scientists were beginning to say that, look, there is species extinction happening at a very high rate, caused for the first time in the history of this planet by a biological species, human beings. So much so that they think that we are in the beginning of a 6th great extinction, which may actually intensify in 300 to 600 years. What I was also saying about this period, so from that they were saying that the overall impact of humanity on the planet was something like the impact of the asteroid that wiped off the dinosaurs. So they were saying that humans act as a geophysical force. We are like a thing in our collectivity. And that's why I came in thinking that in all the histories that I wrote and read, we always made a distinction between humans and things. But these scientists were telling a history where they were claiming humanity has become somewhat like a thing, a huge big thing, which was affecting the whole planet. So it became a planetary force. And I was simply going to finish also by saying that this great acceleration also contains the story of the acceleration of human consumption. So it took, see, if humanity is Homo sapiens are 300,000 years old, it was only in 1986 that we had 1 billion people who consumed consumer gadgets like refrigerators, cars. Then it took 21 years to have 2 billion. Then it took 9 years to have another billion, 3 billion. And then they think in 7 years it'll be 4 billion. And then there'll be 5. And the other interesting change is that in 2000, 70% of the consuming classes came from the industrialized countries of the West and Japan. And now their share of the consuming classes is like 35%. So most of the consuming classes, the new classes are coming from India, China, Latin America, Africa, the newer middle classes. It's out of that I began to argue that the human condition has changed. Because when we were writing humanist histories before, we used to take the planet for granted. So we used to assume that irrespective of how many humans you have on the planet, the real problem was of distribution of wealth, inequality. Irrespective of how many people you have, people can have the same rights and are entitled to the same rights. So we used to work with political thought that was indifferent to the question of how many humans, how much are they consuming, what is the impact on the planet. And so now it seems to me that certain additional things have come about. And gradually we are becoming, gradually things that are planetary are becoming our concerns. So if a philosopher looked at historians or social scientists or humanists in the 20th century and asked, what are the concerns they reflect, human concerns? They would have seen globalization, inequality, neoliberal capitalism, all of those things. Today, thanks to media, questions like sea levels rising, global warming, the possibility of climate refugees, acidification of the oceans, and the question of renewable and non-renewable fuels have all entered our everyday life as matters of concern. So I see a shift from the end of the 20th century to today, in the last 20 years, when we are not only concerned about the story of globalization, we're also concerned about the story of the planet. And without thinking about it, we actually talk about the distinction between planetary time and human time. So for instance, when we talk about renewable and non-renewable fuel, we don't stop to think that if we could live for 300 million years, the planet would make fossil fuels again. So fossil fuels are actually renewable if you count in terms of 300 million years or 200 million years. It is in human time that they are non-renewable. So our sense of time is becoming entangled with planetary time, even through this everyday distinction between renewable and non-renewable. So I thought that a philosopher watching this distinction might say that humans are moving out of a global age into a planetary age, that they are on the cusp of what is the global and the planetary. And maybe I'll end there and take questions or take your comments and then explain other things as the discussion goes on. So I'll stop sharing at this moment. And yeah, okay. So I think I've used up my 20 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever that is.
Ya. ¿Ahí está bien, Gael? ¿Se escucha bien? Sí, ya. Bueno, muchas gracias, Dipesh. Sí, bueno, vamos a hacer un comentario cada uno con Consuelo y después vamos a ir articulando algunas otras preguntas y podemos ir sumando algunas que vayan apareciendo en el chat. Yo me quería centrar sobre todo en la propuesta desde el antropoceno, que ha sido quizás una de las más discutidas y criticadas también desde los primeros textos del 2009, el de las 4 tesis. Me parece que más que ser un libro sobre una manera distinta de hacer historia, que es lo que me parece más interesante de esta propuesta, es que se trata más bien de un enfoque ontológico sobre cómo las percepciones derivadas de las geociencias pueden afectar nuestra manera de autocomprender nuestra propia modernidad, nuestro propio etos moderno. En qué medida estas pueden realmente afectar la manera de concebir lo político. Y en ese sentido el concepto de antropoceno como matriz para aproximarse al problema del cambio climático ha sido bastante discutida y comentada, ya sea por el carácter universalista de sus alcances, por la derivación hacia una nueva forma de entender la especie, o por la importancia que se le otorga al capitalismo en cuanto agente de las transformaciones geológicas del último tiempo. ¿No? El tema de las responsabilidades, en qué medida es una responsabilidad compartida por todos por igual, la jerarquía de las responsabilidades, etc. Me gustaría centrarme en particular en este carácter, en la universalidad de esta responsabilidad de la acción geológica del hombre, en cuanto a especie propia de la perspectiva antropogénica propuesta por el profesor. Desde su artículo citado por acá ya, El clima de la historia, 4 tesis del 2009, él ha planteado, y cito, un universal que surge de la sensación compartida de una catástrofe, cierro comillas, y que nos obligaría a asumir como especie la responsabilidad de nuestro rol colectivo en cuanto a agente biológico y geológico. Esto implica pensar la especie del antropoceno como un agente, como una nueva historia universal humana, pero que al no poder subsumir particularidades, como lo haría un universal de tipo hegeliano, más bien deberíamos llamarla provisoriamente, como decía por entonces, una historia universal negativa, tomando el concepto de ahora. Y para lo que me interesa ver justamente es la recepción que tuvo sobre todo los pensamientos en la izquierda, ¿ya? Cómo fue criticado un poco eso y en qué medida esa crítica ha sido, la ha ido contestando en algunos de los textos, pero también me gustaría cómo ha sido el proceso de digerir esa crítica, cómo fue incorporada, si lo fue o no, un poco más en este texto. Porque en cierta medida esta idea...
Okay, good. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, yes, so the scientists came up with this idea of the Anthropocene, saying that we are moving out of the Holocene epoch and we're entering a new geological epoch. Now, a geological epoch is the smallest periodizing unit in geological history. But even as a small unit, it can be 10 million years, it can be 20 million years. In fact, if the Anthropocene idea is right, then the Holocene will be one of the shortest geological epochs we've seen, because it'll just be 12,000 years. And when they said that, and I said, yes, well, so clearly this is the period when more humans lived, more humans survived, as I was showing through the graphs in the population figures. It didn't mean that they all lived well, but they lived longer. So the average lifespan even of a poor person went up. And that's what I was saying, that we were all in some ways beneficiaries of this expansion of the human realm, which was causing the environmental problems. And actually has also caused the pandemic, the cutting down of forests. But when I was using, but see, the thing is, the scientists were pointing to the fact that this is one connected planet. This is one atmosphere. If it warms up in one place, it warms up somewhere else. The carbon dioxide or the methane gas travels. Even if you produce it nationally, it can go somewhere else. So they were pointing to the fact that this is a planet on which geology, biology are connected, and this is a connected planet. So one planet. But one planet politically does not mean one worldism, because humanity remains divided. And when I was calling it, so I was both recognizing the reality of one planet that the scientists were talking about. And that's what the IPCC works on. All the carbon budget calendars that IPCC gives out is on the assumption this is one planet, and we share it. But on the other hand, humanity constitutes a pluriverse. We are always divided. And when I went to Adorno's idea of negative universal history, it has a very particular connotation. So Adorno is saying that you have a negative universal history when that which you try to incorporate into the history can register the failure of the incorporating process. In other words, to give you examples from multi-species history, suppose you want to create one world in which, let's say, the polar bear are given their say. In Adorno's negative universal history, the question would be, can the polar bear have their say without having to become like humans? So in that European universal history, Europeans always say, you have to become like me. You can only become universal if you become European. In a negative universal history, you're trying to be one, but the failure to become one is also registered. And that's why I said there's a catastrophe. The catastrophe tells us that this is one planet. The planet is, at least the planet that scientists are talking about is one planet. There are some critics who come back and say, but people have different ideas of the planet, and we can talk about that. But Earth system sign refers to this one planet. What I'm saying is one planet does not mean one worldism. It doesn't mean one politics. And that is both an advantage and a disadvantage for humans. It also means that it's impossible for us to keep to the calendars of action that the IPCC gives, because those calendars come out of a science of one planet. have I answered your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Sí, sí.
Okay. Thank you.
No sé si tomo la palabra ahora.
Sí, dale nomás
o...
y después yo sigo con otra.
Dale.
Voy a incorporar algunas de las preguntas que ya han aparecido.
Ok. Muchas gracias por su presentación. Tengo un comentario que está dividido en tres partes, un poco siguiendo o copiándole su metodología. Y primero tengo un comentario que tiene que ver con la ciencia reciente, las cuestiones éticas y las cuestiones de escala. Sabemos que el cambio climático, ¿no es cierto?, usted mismo lo ha dicho, es un wicked problem, pero hace un par de días escuchaba una conferencia de Maisa Rojas, que posiblemente usted no conoce, pero es una científica chilena de renombre internacional, y ella mostraba cómo al graficar las emisiones acumuladas versus la temperatura, existe una relación casi lineal. Para mí fue realmente un descubrimiento, me imagino cómo lo es para muchos que venimos de las ciencias sociales humanas, porque creía que esta relación existía desde la época que se empieza a conceptualizar la idea del antropoceno. Pero me di cuenta que el antropoceno es muy anterior, ¿no es cierto?, a esta evidencia de que emitimos más CO2 por la quema de combustibles fósiles y que con las concentraciones de CO2 en la atmósfera esto se traduce en un aumento de temperatura. Entonces, esta relación entre las emisiones acumuladas y el aumento de la temperatura es una ciencia que no tiene más de 10 años, dice Maisa Rojas. El primer paper es del 2011. O sea, solo tenemos 10 años de evidencia que a mayor emisión, mayor temperatura. Por ende, la gobernanza, las capacidades y las respuestas humanas necesitan ahora quizás cierta urgencia, porque quizás ya no vamos a tener esos 10 años de espera. Entonces son cambios sin precedentes, frente a los cuales hay una cierta factibilidad geofísica, de la que hablan los científicos, tecnológica, económica, dice ella, pero no existe o no está garantizada la factibilidad institucional y sociocultural. Tenemos una cantidad finita de CO2 y por ende tenemos que dejar de emitirlo. Entonces también nos hemos dado cuenta, ¿no es cierto?, que no hay un interés general en la población por, de alguna manera, enfrentar este dilema. Voy a pasar a las cuestiones éticas para ir un poco más rápido. Hay un libro de Candice Callison en la que la autora muestra cómo los conflictos relacionados con las creencias personales participan o tienen un rol muy central en las soluciones viables del cambio climático. O sea, hay cuestiones éticas que finalmente tienen mucho más relación con las cuestiones de cambio climático o con la gobernanza del cambio climático. Y aquí llega un punto, ¿no es cierto?, de que padecemos finalmente el cambio climático de manera muy desigual. Y yendo a algunos comentarios en torno a la crítica que se le ha hecho a Bruno Latour, ¿no es cierto?, sobre todo los argumentos marxistas en que se dice que Latour ha contribuido a vaciar la ecología política contemporánea de las relaciones laborales, y bueno, ese es un tema que da para mucho, pero hace un par de días Bruno Latour decía en la revista Nouvelle Obs que el confinamiento ha demostrado que nuestras sociedades tienen capacidades de cambio que no sospechábamos. El problema es saber qué queremos cambiar y crear esas posibilidades, esas nuevas formas de actuar y de construir de alguna manera la forma de actuar y de hacer las cosas. Entonces, pensar esta historia decolonial del cambio climático, y aquí viene quizás una pregunta muy general, ¿no es cierto?, pero ¿cómo puede ser abordada esta historia decolonial, ¿no es cierto?, del cambio climático en el 2021, en que en un marco como el que estamos actualmente en Chile, en que las luchas sociales, las que vivimos actualmente, conflictos de clases, ¿no es cierto?, y la importancia que cobra la vida, sobre todo frente a esta desigualdad y estas poblaciones, estos problemas sociales, digamos, que de alguna manera han sido desplazados del debate político-ambiental. Y aquí voy al último punto, que tiene que ver con la cuestión de escalas, y lo escuchaba ahora y no pude dejar de pensar en una colega que trabaja en la laguna Inca Kolla, en el desierto de Atacama, y muestra cómo en esta laguna hay evidencia de metales pesados por la presencia.
What's her name?
Inca Kolla. Inca Kolla.
Yeah, they work on saltpeter or something in the laguna, right? Anyway, I think I've read some of the papers, yeah.
Y
Sorry,
en estas lagunas hay presencia de metales pesados que vienen de la minería, que está muy lejos, y que afectan a los rotíferos, que son especies microscópicas que habitan en el agua. Y dentro de estas especies, las hembras, muestra ella, su nombre es Adriana Aranguis, porque si quieren buscar sus trabajos, las especies hembras han desarrollado formas más resistentes frente a la presencia de metales pesados. Entonces, me parece maravilloso esta cuestión de escalas que usted habla, de esta vida o esta edad planetaria, y pensar en esta vida microscópica que pensamos tan frágil y que están íntimamente relacionadas. Y que la historia, desde Fernand Braudel, etcétera, etcétera, han pensado sobre esta cuestión de escala, cómo trasladar eso a esta ciencia del cambio climático actual.
Thank you. To go to the first question, it seems to me that there is the science of climate change, Earth system science, as I say, it speaks of one planet. But clearly we don't have institutions to carry out planetary governance. We have United Nations, which was meant to deal with global problems, not planetary problems. And United Nations was set up as a place where you bargained for time. And even today, when IPCC gives out a calendar, which is for the whole planet, the nations get together and they bargain about how much warming should be tolerated. So the 2 degrees Celsius was a politically bargained figure. It was not a scientific figure. The scientists were saying that we should not have increase over 1.5 degrees on an average, but the nations bargained to stretch it to 2. So I think what is very difficult for global institutions is to deal with a calendar that refers to the planet as one. And that's why the risk of missing the IPCC calendar of action are very high. So even if a scientist says we have only 10 years left, I'm not sure that humanity can, our nations can rise as one. And to give you one example, not of the whole planet, I mean, the Amazon may be another example, but I'm giving an example from India, where I'm from. See, the Himalayas, the mountains, produce 8 or 9 rivers that actually service 8 or 9 countries from Pakistan to Vietnam. But there's no regional governance for maintaining the health of the glaciers. The Himalayas are the most militarized mountain range in the world because of China, India, and Pakistan. And they're actually damaging the environment of the Himalayas. So there is a kind of decalage or kind of a phase lag between the rhythm of global politics and the needs of planetary governance. So there is clearly what you might describe as an institutional deficit. And I think nation states have to give up some of their powers to move towards planetary governance. And that's a struggle. That politics has not evolved yet. The ethical question, the ethical question is very important because, most places the poor are going to suffer more, and they're already suffering more. And you talk about scales. Sometimes the scale question is so unbelievable. On a negative side, so fishing women in the Bay of Bengal, in the Delta region, who actually stand in rivers to catch small fish with their baskets, are finding out that the fish have changed because the rivers have become salty. Seawater has moved in. But the salt in the water is actually affecting their reproductive organs, creating fungal infection and other problems, even in the uterus. And some very bad doctors have moved in and are actually carrying out hysterectomy to make money from these people. So the feminists are trying to lobby the government to bring in laws to regulate hysterectomy. I wouldn't have connected climate change with hysterectomy. So it's such an important problem. It has so many different impacts on so many different scales. I'm just giving you one example to give you how this question comes up in people's lives. In the Indian coast, in south coast Kerala, poor women, the water has become so salty that women along the coast have to go longer distances to get fresh water for cooking, because you can't cook with salt water. So the ethical question is very important. The pandemic, going back to what Bruno said, I don't know what Bruno Latour said, but I saw him recently. The pandemic has shown us many things. Whether we'll learn from it is a different question. The pandemic has shown us that when humans are forced to withdraw, the rivers become clean, the air is cleaner, you see more birds and animals, they come back. So it's clear that if humans withdrew, we begin to see things that we didn't see before. But if you think of the way how humans talk, we feel very nostalgic about the past. When we think about the future, and when I say, I want to come to Chile and see you, I imagine the past as my future. So, and that is the problem with learning. The problem with learning is that our institutions that give us hope, sense of future, were all built in the 20th century. And were built on the backs of fossil fuel, on high energy, right? Sorry, excuse me, I'll just... okay, sorry. What I was saying was that, so in some ways, Latour says it beautifully, actually. He says, people still want the futures they cannot have. And this is a generational question. So if you look at somebody my age, about to retire, all my money is working in the, stock exchange. And if I think of next 20 years, my retired years, I hope capitalism to do well, right? That's where my hopes are. I mean, it may not. But if you speak to a school child, they are actually looking at a different future. So it's a very generational question. And sometimes, my now deceased colleague, Lauren Berland, she had a beautiful idea of cruel optimism. That is actually hoping for that which damages you. So in many respects, our consumption habits, our lifestyles have evolved out of the Great Acceleration. They've evolved out of the expansion of the human realm in the 20th century and 21st century. And we are now being told to actually cut back. And we don't have the institutions to help us do those things. So it looks voluntary. Somebody says, I will buy an electrical car. Or somebody says, I'll give up eating meat. It looks voluntary, but we actually need institutions to help us do the transition. And that's why politics is very important. I mean, without the political work, it will be very difficult to get what we need. And I think the involvement of young people who have not yet, like me, bought into the futures that come out of the 20th century. People who are actually facing futures that belong to the 21st century. The message has to go to them, and they have to be able to influence politicians. We have to help them to influence politicians to make changes, but to create institutions that actually help us make those changes. It's at the moment, among people I talk to, it's all voluntary. Somebody say, okay, I will stop eating meat, or okay, I will not travel by plane. But the pure voluntarism cannot work. I mean, it's ethical, it's good, but it doesn't reach the scale.
Ya, puede tomar yo un par de preguntas, profesor, que han aparecido en el chat. Voy a vincular un poco lo que estaba hablando antes. Relacionado con el tema de la responsabilidad respecto al cambio climático, ¿cuáles son los principales desafíos para alcanzar esta concepción universal de responsabilidad de la especie? Sobre todo en el actual contexto de pandemia. El libro además apareció cuando la pandemia estaba recién comenzando, así que la pregunta es un poco si el desarrollo de la misma ha afectado un poco las ideas que pudo plasmar en el libro, dado que es un contexto que parece poner en evidencia las
yes, in a
desigualdades del
sense,
sistema.
sorry. Finish.
Sí,
No, please finish.
desigualdad. Ya, del sistema capitalista y que han aumentado considerablemente, haciendo que una propuesta como la suya a veces criticada como apolítica, justamente, por lo mismo. ¿Existen medidas concretas que usted haya podido observar en el último tiempo que permitan creer que es posible revertir de alguna manera la relación negativa para el planeta entre tecnología y la llamada carbon democracy en este contexto de pandemia?
See, we would not be so many human beings without technology. And without technology, I mean, if we did not have technology that connected us, if we could not move food from one part of the world to another, if we could not move medicines from one part of the world to another quickly, we would not be so many in numbers. The indigenous societies, for instance, support a small number of people. As I said, in 1900, we were 1.6 billion people. And it took us almost 300,000 years to get to the figure of 1 billion. So this rise is because of antibiotics and things. But what interestingly infectious disease specialists say, Anthony Fauci, who was advising Trump and also Biden on the pandemic, in their academic writing, they say that we have entered an era of pandemics, where pandemics can happen with more frequency. In the last 20 years, 75% of the new emergent infectious diseases have come from wild animals, zoonotic diseases. And the main reason is cutting down of forests. So there are two ways to go. One is to not cut down so many forests, contract the human realm. But the way in which we tend to go is to create more vaccines. There's a discussion about whether pandemics should be managed globally, whether WHO should have more powers. There's discussion about whether satellite phones can be used as an early warning system to find out where a pandemic is breaking out so that you can confine it to that place. But that's all based on the assumption that humans will go on doing what they're doing. I read somewhere that if we cut down 25% of the forest cover in the world, we are in trouble. And we are somewhere around 17%. So clearly, if we follow this path of development, then there will be a civilizational crisis. I mean, the crisis will intensify. And that's why I think the answer is political, is to mobilize, but it's not easy. Because as I say, I mean, in India and China, I mean, they all share these glaciers. They can see that the glaciers are receding, but they have not, every nation state is thinking, I will win this battle over the other one. So in a global framework, nation states like the United States, they become much more security minded. So anti-immigration, we won't let people come in. So the politics we have is exactly the opposite of the politics we need. And as a teacher or as a student of I can only say this. And then but it's clear that the Anthropocene or climate change or the pandemic, it fragments human futures. It tends to create multiple futures. Some people face terrible futures. Some people feel we can create our own little future, save ourselves. Elon Musk and people can think that we'll leave this planet and go somewhere else. And that's why some people come back criticizing me to say to me, and I've had a very good discussion with Latour in a paper that we wrote together called conflicts of planetary proportions, where he was saying, look, against this one planet of the scientists, there are multiple planets that humans are creating. So there is the planet of Elon Musk that Latour calls planet exit. I want to leave this planet and go somewhere else, right? And he has this map, and I said, but there is also another planet that comes from the experience of colonization and decolonization, which is the dreams of emancipation, that we will live well, that we will live in a just society. We'll have more equality. And I said, whether or not politicians believe in that, its moral force is still around. So when China says, or India says, in a negotiation that I want to use coal because I have to pull so many millions out of poverty, that statement has a moral force. And it has a moral force because from 19th century on, we have believed in these dreams of emancipation of human beings. So what this crisis does is, in many ways, it fragments futures, because beforehand you would have thought, okay, one day we'll all be capitalist, or one day we'll all be socialist, or one day we'll all be democratic. It fragments that narrative. And as I was saying, that the pandemic and the climate change, they come out of the same problem, the great acceleration. But the pandemic produces a different kind of future, where you think future is going back to what we had, being able to do what you could do before the pandemic. So I think what I'm trying to say as a historian is that many of our political ideas, the carbon democracy point that you're making, they still come out of the 20th century developments. They're still like as if we have not heard about climate change. Whereas we have heard about climate change through a science that creates one planet, but we don't have one planet governance mechanism. And it fragments the futures, and what we have is a global institution meant to deal with global problems, and that's the United Nations. And the United Nations was formed on the assumption that human beings had indefinite time to solve all problems. It's a typical question. You just go to the United Nations and ask, how many resolutions have the General Assembly passed on the Israel-Palestine question? And I grew up hearing about the 80th resolution, the 81st resolution. These are all gestures of buying time. Whereas the scientists come and tell you, look, you got 10 years, you can't buy time. And we still want to buy time because that's the structure. So that's why I say it's a deep predicament for human beings. So people sometimes rush and say, what's the solution? There are solutions on paper. You can say, stop producing coal today. And even then, you won't get immediate solution, because the climate problem is a backloaded problem. The effects you feel today is of historical greenhouse gas emissions, not of the emissions that's happening today. So I go back to this expression that that I think Consuelo used, a wicked problem. So a wicked problem is defined as a problem that you can diagnose and explain, but can't solve in one go, because it has so many dimensions to it. But again, that doesn't, but there are tasks, there are things to be done. We need these global institutions. We need institutions to help us make transition. The transition should not be voluntary. And we need to put pressures on our governments when they go to negotiate at these COP meetings. We need to put pressure on them to say, you need to do something. And that means mobilization. So in Europe, for instance, whatever one thinks of Greta Thunberg, she brought school kids out, or got school kids involved. And I think we need to involve younger people, because they actually face the future that we fear.
Consuelo, ¿tú tenías alguna pregunta o tomo yo? Varias personas han preguntado, y usted lo desarrolla mucho en en el libro, lo desarrolla bastante, pero que tiene que ver con el concepto de antropoceno y por qué en el fondo la inclinación hacia ese y no el de capitoloceno.
Capitalism.
Ya.
No, okay, I mean, when I started my work, I used the expression Anthropocene. It gave rise to debates about Capitalocene. And honestly, I've never denied the role of capitalism, and I don't mind what you call it. You can call it Capitalocene. But the fact is, even people who call it Capitalocene have to understand Earth system science. This they did not have to do before. I mean, you could be a Marxist in the 20th century with no knowledge of Earth system science. You cannot be a Marxist who talks about Capitalocene with no knowledge of Earth system science. That's the change. So I don't have any dispute. If somebody wants to call it Capitalocene, some people call it Econocene, because we are not talking about what caused it. Because I mean, if I say capitalism caused it, what are you going to do with capitalism? You're going to overthrow it, do a revolution? I mean, not in 10 years' time. So you have to work through capitalism. But if it gives you moral satisfaction to say capitalism caused it, I have no problems with that. But the question, my point is that even the position of the Marxists has changed because they have to read something else today to understand the problem, which they would not have read in the 20th century, which is Earth system science. Now, sometimes they go back and say, oh, Marx predicted this. Marx had already had a sense that climate crisis would come. Now, that's like Christians reading the Bible. I mean, that I can't argue. I mean, believers will always find in their text of faith that everything about the world was foretold. I mean, when Marx died before somebody worked out the relationship between carbon dioxide emission and temperature rise, which was worked out in the 1890s, few years after Marx died. And for Marxists to claim that Marx had already worked out the climate problem, I think it's like sort of, in India, our epic is called Mahabharata, and there are people who say that if it is not in the Mahabharata, which means the greater India, it can't be in India, because it must be first in the text for it to be there out there in the world. Now, that you can't argue with. That's a believer statement. But it's a fact that even the diehard Marxist today has to read geology, has to read some atmospheric science if they want to engage with the climate change problem. So even their position has changed. Now, if they want to call it Capitalocene, I mean, that's fine. It doesn't matter. Because all that the Anthropocene people are trying to say is to look at evidence in the rocks of the planet to say that we are no longer in the Holocene. And one of the geologists actually said that, look, the word Anthropocene is causing so much problems because it would have been easier to understand what we are talking about if rats had caused it. If we had called it Ratocene or something like that, then they would have understood what we're talking about. We're talking about is the fact that it's a thought experiment. If in future, millions of years from today, some geologist came to this planet and looked at the evidence in the strata of the planet, they would have said, something happened in this period. There was some creature here that changed the geological history of the planet. That's all that they're saying. But stratigraphers are not trying to assign a cause to this.
Creo que tenemos una pregunta más, me parece, por tiempo. Aquí voy a revisar. Para hacer una vinculado con esto, o sea, si bien me parece muy clarificador la explicación que hace respecto del uso del concepto capitoloceno y antropoceno, se podría decir que en el fondo la relación con la crítica marxista, que ha sido quizás la más persistente, es más bien con aquella que tiene una perspectiva un poco más, digamos, economicista, eurocéntrica o excesivamente antropocéntrica que con los postulados de Marx original, en términos morales sobre todo. Como usted acaba de decir, muchas de las cosas Marx no tenía idea que empezaron a ocurrir, o lo empezamos a dar cuenta después de que Marx murió. El mismo Marx y Engels le reprueban a Bauer en la ideología alemana el separar la historia humana de la natural, como si fuesen dos cosas distintas, cuando habla de la dialéctica de la historia natural y la dialéctica de la historia humana. Y sobre la cuestión judía habla justamente que le parece intolerable que todas las criaturas se hayan vuelto propiedad privada. En ese sentido, me gustaría saber si usted ve o hay una relación, o ha tenido una relación distinta después de su itinerario marxista de los estudios poscoloniales, a una vuelta hacia un Marx un poco más original, o el primer Marx, por decirlo de una manera.
Well, yeah, I mean, particularly so something that I want to say is that this question of other creatures that you talked about. So it turns out that the majority of forms of life on the planet are forms that we cannot see with our eyes because they're microbial. So microbes form the majority of lives on this planet. And all the lives that you can see are minority forms of life. And humans are an extremely minority form of life. So I often say that if the viruses were humans, then our knowledge of viruses would have looked like colonial knowledge. Because we know about them to control them, to defeat them, to fend them off. And there are a lot of viruses and microbes we don't know about. I mean, like we didn't know about this coronavirus that has now spread. And the interesting thing is that people don't think about it when you think of the pandemic. But the lesson of virology is that every technology you develop, including medicine, to deal with bacteria and viruses, also become evolutionary pathways for those bacteria and viruses. So the fact that we have got this thing called Delta variant of the virus means we are actually, there's also a Darwinian history being enacted in front of our eyes, and our bodies have become evolutionary pathways for this virus. So people, I mean, that's the story of antibiotic resistant viruses. You know, for certain diseases, it now takes 30 times the amount of antibiotics to treat them than it did in the 1940s. So basically, everything you throw in the path of a virus or bacteria also becomes an evolutionary pathway for that bacteria or the virus to evolve. And that's a history we are part of. We can't control, you can fight a particular bacteria or a virus that's attacking you. But this Darwinian history you can't stop. And the person who said it very clearly was actually Carl Sagan's wife, Lynn Margulis, and his son wrote a book called Microcosms, where they actually spoke about this microbial world. And so in some ways, going back to Marx and Engels, of course, Marx and Engels read nature and knew about nature in the way that nature was talked about in their times. And they knew soil science as it existed in their times. But on the other hand, Marx, and particularly Marx he also thought that that this industrial civilization, if socially controlled, would bring about some kind of emancipation for human beings. I mean, the kind of praise that Marx gave to the industrial bourgeoisie in the Communist Manifesto is very rare in the history of capitalism. And he probably wrote the best lines of praise for the revolutionary side of capitalism. What he saw as the revolutionary side of capitalism. But it's what I was trying to critique was the idea that that somehow Marx would have known about a problem or would have been able to foresee a problem that nobody knew about in his time. People knew about the degradation of the soil because of enclosure movement, but sometimes people pick up these 2 or 3 passages and read deeply into them to kind of find a Marx who was much more omniscient than human beings or even the best scholars really are. That's all that I was saying.
Está silenciado, Tato.
Perdón, ahí sí, la costumbre. Que queríamos, antes de cerrar, darle unos minutos a los amigos de la editorial Mimesis, que editaron recientemente un libro, un conjunto de ensayos de Dipesh, para que les hablen un poquito de ello, del libro, y ojalá que lo puedan adquirir, porque está muy bueno, además, y mucho material inédito en español.
Muchas gracias, Patricio. En nombre de Mariluz y el mío, Raúl Rodríguez Freire, les damos las gracias por este evento, por participar de acá, de este conversatorio. Gracias a la Escuela de Historia UC. Es un gusto ver a Rafael Gaune, así sea a la distancia, viejo amigo, a Consuelo Biskupovich, que también presentó una edición del libro en español. Para nosotras es un honor haber podido publicar Clima y Capital, la vida bajo el Antropoceno, de Dipesh Chakrabarty, un autor, un historiador, un intelectual que admiramos muchísimo. Su trabajo en los años 80 en el grupo de estudios subalternos fue imprescindible, un texto de lectura obligatoria para nosotros en nuestras formaciones. Sus trabajos sobre la provincialización de Europa fueron textos claves. Luego, historias de minorías, pasados subalternos, la crítica con la Escuela Historiográfica de Inglaterra, la forma en que realizó una crítica a Hobsbawm, clave, ¿no? Y ahora ya yo diría que el trabajo de Dipesh Chakrabarty desborda el ámbito de la historia, sin ninguna duda es uno de los intelectuales más importantes para la discusión de las relaciones entre las humanidades y el cambio climático. Con su trabajo nosotros inauguramos una línea dentro de nuestra editorial que se llama Mundos por Venir. Y precisamente Mundos por Venir está afectada hoy día por la pandemia, porque hay una escasez de papel y no podemos imprimir todavía, tenemos que esperar un tiempo, porque el papel que se imprime en Chile viene de China. Yeah. Y con la crisis que hay hoy de... Claro, de contenedores.
Same problem here with paper.
Claro, es en todo el mundo. Y con este libro, Clima y Capital, inauguramos una serie que continúa con un libro de Jussi Parikka, se llama Antropoceno en español. Viene un libro de Anna Singh y también de Joanna Zilinska. Es una colección que viene a discutir en español cuestiones de cambio climático, y no puedo dejar de mencionar que el libro de Dipesh Chakrabarty es un libro con coraje, ¿no? Porque sin miedo usa conceptos que en el ámbito de las humanidades han sido problemáticos. Uno de esos es el de especie, ¿no? También la relación con las ciencias duras, ¿no? Con la geología, y el lugar en que ahora la literatura, la filosofía y la historia empieza a dialogar con el ámbito de la biología, la química, la física, la geología. En ese sentido es un libro que abre, digamos, caminos para quienes nos interesamos por el devenir, no solo de las disciplinas, sino también por el devenir de la historia humana. Y en ese sentido creo que también es un libro con coraje, porque también sin miedo discute la forma de vida que tiene no solo la sociedad contemporánea, sino la humanidad en su conjunto, ¿no? Y eso es lo que resulta problemático para algunas personas y que permite mantener bastante álgida la discusión sobre si es capitaloceno, antropoceno, tecnoceno y otras posibilidades. Por último, señalar que nuestros libros tienen un componente de gráfico, de diseño muy importante. Este libro en particular está acompañado con obras visuales de la artista colombiana Clemencia Echeverry, que viene trabajando hace muchos años también lo que hoy llamamos antropoceno, pero que ella viene trabajando en Colombia, desde el arte, y señalar que en América Latina el antropoceno, sobre todo en Colombia, como lo trabaja Clemencia Echeverry, se articula con violencias locales. No es solo la violencia del capital, sino que también es la violencia de las dictaduras, en Chile, pero en el caso de Colombia, la violencia de los desplazamientos, el conflicto, digamos, de la violencia en Colombia, y el extractivismo, ¿no? Entonces, el antropoceno, digamos, el cambio climático, los problemas del cambio climático, son unas formas de la violencia, o una forma de violencia que se articulan con otras formas de violencia en América Latina, y en ese sentido, el libro de Dipesh Chakrabarty nos permite pensar el tiempo profundo con las complejidades de la historia contemporánea que nosotros vivimos además en nuestras pequeñas historias y tiempos del día a día, ¿no? Así que sin más, darle las gracias nuevamente a Patricio, a las personas que nos han invitado, que han estado acá, y sobre todo a Dipesh por la confianza en esta pequeña editorial desconocida del sur del mundo, que hizo con mucho cariño y con mucho afecto un libro que para nosotros es muy importante. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for publishing it. Thank you.
Welcome.
Bueno, muchas gracias Raúl, Mariluz. Bueno, y muchas gracias profesor. Estaba justamente, creo que ayer revisando los correos, creo que fue el 2014 la primera vez que hablamos, hace mucho tiempo que estábamos tratando de organizar algo. Al principio la idea era que viniera, después alguna vez por Puerto de Ideas no se pudo.
Yeah.
Así que finalmente pudimos tener esta conversación que creo que fue muy, muy enriquecedora para todas y todos. Ojalá que los que les interese el libro puedan adquirirlo ahí en Mimesis. No sé si hay algún ejemplar ya, Raúl, o todavía no hay nada de nada por la crisis del papel.
No, este alcanzamos a publicarlo y está en busca libre en todas las... va a ir una primavera del libro el próximo fin de semana, y ahí vamos a estar con este y otros libros de la editorial, y está en toda la librería de Santiago en realidad, y en nuestra página web también.
Súper.
Vamos a estar en Plaza Inés de Suárez el otro fin de semana.
Ya, buenísimo, ahí para que puedan adquirirlo. Bueno, y sin más, le agradecemos a todos, al profesor Dipesh Chakrabarty, agradecemos también, bueno, a Mimesis, al Instituto de Historia, y desde el Instituto de Historia UC los esperamos por una próxima sesión de Residencias en Historia, así que muchísimas gracias y que estén muy bien.
Thank you very much.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Thank you, stay well. Thank you very much. Thank
Gracias,
you.
Dipesh.
Muchas gracias. Gracias a todos.
Thank you.
¿Queda grabado para verlo?
Sí, queda grabado.
En español parece, creo.
Y en inglés.
En
o sea, en
ambas.
inglés.
Ah, buenísimo. Ya.